Hello everyone and welcome to Superman Homepage Live, brought to you by supermanhomepage.com, the #1 Superman fan site in the world. In this, our November 14th, 2022 show, we're going to be speaking to our special guest tonight, Dan Jurgens, in commemoration of the 30th anniversary of the death of Superman. We're also going to take questions and comments from you, our live listeners, live watchers, so that you can get involved in the show, and Michael's going to explain how all that works. And let me introduce you to my co-host, Mr. Michael Bailey. Hello, Michael.
Hey, Steve. How's it going?
Doing well yourself?
It's really I am excited.
I can tell.
It's really funny because, like 30 years ago, I was actually getting ready for a play, but I was also really excited about the death of Superman. 20 years ago, I emailed Dan to ask questions for an article I was writing for the homepage, and now I get to spend this hour with you talking with him. But we want to encourage everybody else to get involved with that, and it's really dirt simple. All you do is go to supermanhomepage.com/live and click that you'd like to be in the show. You'll be in the green room. You'll get to watch the show in real time as it happens. But if you aren't at your computer right now, you could take your little handy-dandy smartphone and scan that QR code that's right next to me and get in that way. If you are doing that, please use your headset, because when you just use the phone speaker, it kind of crackles.
Yes, indeed. And if you're shy and don't want to get on the phone or on the computer tonight and talk with us, you can also send a question on YouTube right there beneath us. Ask your questions, post your comments. Michael and I will keep an eye on those to react to them as the show goes along, and we will endeavour to introduce those into the show as where possible. But without any further ado, let me, before I introduce our guest tonight, thank our sponsors and patrons, Douglas Meacham, John Patrick Van Pelt, and Tina Murray, and we appreciate your support. You can click the join button below if you also want to be a supporter of our show. But let me introduce our special guest tonight. He really needs no introduction other than to say comic book writer and artist, Dan Jurgens. Welcome, Dan.
Hi, guys.
How are you?
Quite well. And how are you guys tonight?
Doing very well. Thank you so much for taking the time out to speak to us tonight. It is a big week in the world of Superman, with the 30th anniversary of Superman number 75, the death of Superman. Michael and I over the last couple of weeks have been building up to this, looking at the covers that were coming out at this time 30 years ago, leading up to this very week. It must be a busy week for you. I imagine that you're getting questions left, right, and center.
Yeah, it has been. And, it's weird because in a way it feels like we just wrapped up the book, last week. And, here it is, it's out, and it's a reality, which is always kind of fun. It's, fun to have it on the stands and see how everyone reacts.
Excellent. Well, as I said, we really appreciate the fact that you're taking some time out with us tonight. I think we had, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, but Dan was a guest on our show before we went visual, when we were called Radio KAL.
I don't know if we've had. I mean, Jeff and I have had him on several times on From Crisis to Crisis, and hope to get him back. When we get back to that. I know we had John on.
Yeah, that's right. We did too.
Before we went.
Okay.
But it was just an oversight, Dan. It was just, I think one of the interns got some paperwork messed up, so I apologize for that.
I think it's a case of saving the best for last.
Yeah, there you go.
For sure.
It's going to be interesting this time, interviewing you and actually seeing you as I interview you, instead of it being like over Skype. So. Oh,
sure. Yeah, true.
Now, you won't remember this, Dan, but we actually met very, very, very briefly. We were both walking out of the world premiere of Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice in New York. We crossed paths, and I just said to you, "Hi, Dan, I love your work," and you had no idea who I was, obviously, and nor should you. But I was just, it was snowing at that time. I don't know if you recall, coming out of that premiere, and the only day that I didn't wear any kind of snow gear, because obviously I was dressed up to be at this premiere, wearing nice fancy clothes, and the only night that it actually snowed there.
Oh yeah, and it was weird because later we were all going to a party and everything, and like my wife is wearing high heels and a short dress, and everyone's all dressed up, and go outside, and it's a miserable, snowy night with all sorts of muck in the gutters and everything. It didn't
wasn't
match
fun.
the fun of the evening, that's for sure.
For sure. Well, we'll get into talking about the death of Superman. Michael, I'll allow you to go first.
Yeah, this is a question I like to ask all of the creators, just because I'm kind of fascinated by this aspect of the death. What was your reaction to the media explosion that happened when it hit the press that Superman was going to die?
Oh, I was shocked. I mean, well, first of all, there were a couple of different waves, and some of that is because, of course, when the solicitations first came out, and so to go back to that time, we still had 3 distributors in those days. So when the book was solicited, The Death of Superman, we got a little bit of coverage then, and that sort of started to push it, and then it died off somewhat after that. But then as we got closer to the book coming out, it really started to ramp up again, and it got bigger and bigger, and we just kept kind of saying, wow, this is amazing that people are paying this kind of attention. And then, of course, the week the book kind of came out, it just exploded. So we never could have guessed anything like that would happen, that we would get that kind of coverage. And what I have always found fascinating about it is that as we set up the funeral for a friend part of the storyline, where we were really going to deal with this question of, what does Superman mean to the world? What does he mean to the Justice League? What does he mean to, Perry White, Jimmy Olsen, and everybody else? And how would the world react? That we actually saw the world start to react just as we were writing it. And that is the kind of synchronicity you can't possibly plan for. I mean, you talk about lightning never striking twice. There was no way it was anything like that would ever happen again.
Fascinating. So yeah, it was just an incredible time. Michael brought this to my attention, and we have to ask this question, and I kind of briefly brought it up there, and I'm going to show it again here right now. What was Darkseid doing at Superman's funeral in the poster that came with Superman 75?
It's called respect. Seriously? So we went through this list of who should we put in, and we really wanted DC represented as it was at that time. And we specifically talked about Darkseid, and it really was just in those terms, which was respect. And we thought, we see this in fiction a lot, where someone's greatest enemy will miss the fact that their counterpart is gone. So that's why Darkseid was there.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and the reason why I asked that is I came across a TikTok of somebody looking at the Ivan Reis variant cover to the special, and they're just laughing about the fact that Darkseid's there. And I'm like, yeah, we were kind of confused about that in 1992 as well. But respect is great.
Well, let's add something else, because this was seriously a part of the discussion at the time. Superman and Darkseid, they had faced off, but were they really enemies? And I think they were different levels of beings in a way, and obviously it's not like they were allies. But if you think of Superman's rogues gallery, for example, and if you think of Luthor, if you think of Brainiac, Darkseid didn't occupy that space, right? And I think that we looked at it and said, Darkseid and Superman could be adversaries, but not necessarily, bitter enemies. And that again goes to the way we saw Superman's relationship with Darkseid.
Wow.
Yeah, and that was also a time period before. I mean, it's only a recent phenomenon of Darkseid is there for Superman to hit.
Yes.
It was. Yeah. So that it did. I always liked that he was there, but it was a head scratcher until you explained it like that. So, now the book's out. 75 comes out. what was it like for you then? I mean, because we're on the other end, we're on the other side, where you're into the aftermath of it. Do you have any like particular anecdotes or memories of what you were thinking, or any weird encounters with fans, that kind of thing?
Well, part of it was my phone was ringing off the hook because uh, I had a public phone number at that time, or I was in the phone book, and so people were looking it up or calling information up, and just the phone was ringing nonstop. And in some cases, it might have been a reporter or the media, sort of reaching out to make contact, and other times it was people expressing almost hate for what we were doing. How dare you kill Superman? That it was a range of reactions that covers the spectrum, or covered the spectrum, much as you might guess. Um, One thing I can tell you, so in terms of an odd little anecdote from that time, if you can put up the poster again, that was from Superman 75.
Yep.
So that took me almost pretty much a week to draw, because it was a much larger piece of art, much bigger than a comic book page. And the idea of setting up all the characters, going through the list of who was going to be on it and everything like that, it was pretty intense. So I finally got it done one day late in the afternoon, had just packed it all up as an oversized piece of art. So it's a mammoth kind of flat package that I had packed up and reinforced every possible way to send to Brett Breeding for inking. And at that, just gotten it done, and I had put it out on the front step because FedEx was going to come and pick it up. And Mike Carlin gave me a call to tell me that Joe Shuster had just died. So that was really kind of a freak out thing, to have just drawn that casket with the S shield on that and then get that news. It was just one of those really odd coincidences.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's interesting to think of that poster existing. As fans, we get the comic when it comes out, so
right.
Thinking of that, it's been drawn months in advance hardly ever enters our mind. So, because I remember when that was announced in the comics, so it would have been even earlier than that. So, I don't know why I'm fascinated by that, but I am. You going on with that. You did several tours around this time as well. Didn't you go down to Florida for the relief for Hurricane Andrew as well?
I did not. I was supposed to be, but I actually, my flights got canceled by a blizzard that hit the local area, so I didn't make it. Unfortunately, in the middle of winter, yes, I lost my trip to Florida. So everybody else got to go, but not me.
Uh-huh. Fascinating times. So just moving forward a little bit from that, because obviously, we're looking 30 years back, but you've been involved with Superman along the way, in many different times since then. Rebirth was an interesting time period for Superman. You and Peter Tomasi took the character that, to my mind, had been floundering a bit around 2014, 2015, and you brought him back, along with Lois, to a more traditional version of the character and his world. Did you and Peter get much pushback on this, and was it a conscious decision to have the changes be gradual rather than just say, boom, the old Superman is back?
No, we didn't get any pushback whatsoever. And part of it is because I had set it all up really with the Lois and Clark miniseries that I had done, that really established the backdrop for Lois and Clark and Jon. That I think of that project as pre-Rebirth in a way, because that really, if you think about it, would have been, I think, the first sort of Rebirth effort. And you're right, up until that point, I don't think that DC was necessarily terribly happy with where the Superman franchise was. So they realized the need that they had to get back to certain elements. And, I had already introduced the broad parameters of how that might work through the convergence issues that I had done. And that's where Jon Kent was born. And when I did that, one of the things I had told Dan DiDio at the time is, Jon can be the future. I don't know what that future is, but Jon represents the future. He gives you a new tomorrow. And in fact, one of the things that I first pitched as part of that was this idea that we had the Convergence world with Clark and Lois on it, that the world would be coming to an end, and they would put infant Jon in a rocket ship and shoot him off into space. And I said, the last thing we see is the rocket going off into space, and then we pick up on it sometime later, and I'm not saying what that would be. I don't know, but there's future story there. And that's how we decided to really start to work with the idea of Clark and Lois being parents, of Jon being a presence in the DC universe, so that, you know, cut to a few months later when they decided, yeah, we've kind of got to, you know, get back to where we want to be with Superman. How are we going to do it? That I did the Superman, the Lois and Clark miniseries, and established that, you know, Clark had been around all this time, kind of working in secret, that there was this other Superman out there. And then later, as we actually got into Rebirth, yeah, the idea was take that Superman and the previous one, the New 52 Superman, if you will, and kind of do a merger so that we don't throw everything out from the New 52, but really what it was is committing to what that version of Superman was with Lois, not Wonder Woman, and with Jon.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Now, on Twitter a few months back, you mentioned that Conduit was part of your plans if your Rebirth run on Action Comics had continued. Was the decision to hand the character to Bendis a sudden one? I'm not asking for like inside dirt or anything like that. I'm just wondering, you know, how much you had mapped out before the creative change happened.
Well, let's put it this way. Peter Tomasi and I had each, we had gotten together to write kind of a joint treatment for what Action 1000 would have been, and then where our books would have gone after that. And we had reasonable expectation that we were going to be doing those stories. Things happened. Things always happen in comics. It's not as though that was as... It was unusual, but not tremendously so. I mean, these are the kind of decisions that come down the pike, and these are the things that happen. So from there, then, we detoured into, obviously, something that was quite a lot different for Action 1000, which was really ended up being the farewell as much as anything. But that's kind of where we were at that time, yeah.
So was bringing Conduit back. That the reason why I ask about Conduit specifically is it seems like he's a villain that had a specific thing to do. You accomplish that, and then he's dead at the end of it. You brought him back in Booster Gold. What do you remember what the Superman story would have been, or do you just want to keep that under wraps in case you get to tell that story one day?
Well, let's put it this way. You know, one of the things about Conduit that I think works really well is the fact that there was a connection to Clark in his life in Smallville. And if you think back to kind of that classic bit with Superman and Clark and Lex Luthor, Clark and Lex knew each other back in the day, back in Smallville, right? And then we kind of lost that moving forward to where, you know, Superman went when John Byrne kind of redid everything. But this idea of Superman having someone who knew who he was and does go back to his time in Smallville, I thought would be something that is always interesting and always something good to pick up on, because it gives him that connection to the past. And at that point, we no longer had the Kents. And I always was looking for things that connect to the past, because I think there's a lot of interest there. And I thought the other part of that would be really interesting is the idea that now we have Jon as part of it. And so I think that there was something there. Well, I don't think. I know there was a lot there to build on, and it would have been nice to do it. But yeah, that was all a part of it, and I still think that's credible. And also, the other part of it is, if you go back to the Superman movie that came out a few years ago, where we first saw Henry Cavill, there's a scene in the movie where young Clark is kind of beat up out on the Kent farm by a kid that pulls him out of the pickup truck. That was Conduit. That was Kenny Braverman. So it wasn't named that way in the movie, but it was listed that way in the script, and it reads that way in the credits. And I think there's always something there. I like connective tissue in stories, and if there's something you can go back and find in a character's past that can develop that sense of interest in the present, yeah, I thought there was a lot there to work with. Still do.
Room for growth there, definitely. Couple of things you've mentioned. You've mentioned Jon a couple of times, and we spoke about Brian Michael Bendis just briefly. Fans are commenting, asking some questions about the aging of Jon and how they, made him a lot older now than what he was introduced. And a lot of fans, were really, interested in the young Jon Kent rather than him being a teenager or a young adult as he is now. How do you feel about Jon being aged up so quickly?
I mean, I didn't do it, and I always hesitate to comment on other people's stories.
No, fair enough.
I'm certainly willing to comment on my own. Brian and I actually talked about it quite a lot, and I know what Brian was going for, and I understand exactly why he wanted to do what he did, and I don't find fault with it. At the same time, I probably would have stuck with Jon as a younger character for a while, because I think in comics, part of what we like to get used to is this slow cooker effect as people age at that kind of a pace that, if we look at where Spider-Man is right now, it's not like he's 65 years old, right? We want to see that slow kind of gradual bit. And I think there was a lot there to be done with Jon and Clark and Lois as a unit. At the same time, I totally respect what Brian did. He and I are friends. He brought an incredible amount of passion and energy to the books when he came in to do them. And what he was going for was really not just defensible, it was admirable. I understood what he was trying to do.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And what about the secret identity, Clark Kent being outed? Is that a can of worms that DC can necessarily shove back in, or is moving forward? How would where if you got to write Clark Kent Superman, where would you take that angle?
Well, I think there my work speaks for itself. I had already been brought in to fix it once. That was one of the things that got broken as part of New 52, right? So when I came in, one of the things I specifically said is, you have to deal with this. We can't, it just doesn't work. There are certain things that the world understands about Superman, and one of them is that his secret identity is Clark Kent. And at that time, I thought that's what worked best. So here again, I'll let my work speak for itself.
Now you're entering, if I did the math correctly, you're entering your 5th decade working on something Superman related. You had your first run, which was 10 years. There was the Day of Doom miniseries, which is turning 20 this year. You did 6 issues during the New 52, the Lois and Clark, Rebirth, and now you've got a strip coming up in Action Comics starting next year. What is it about Superman that keeps drawing you back into his orbit?
I find Superman to be a tremendously compelling character. And at that point, I'm underselling it. I love the character, but just because you love a character doesn't mean you can necessarily write the character. There are a lot of characters that I have great fondness for that I don't think I would try and write because I probably wouldn't be right for it. But I find him tremendously compelling, and I always find it interesting that so often I have people say something like, well, isn't Superman hard to write? Isn't he difficult to write? I don't find it that way at all. I think there are so many types of stories you can do with Superman, and I think he means so much that a lot of it is once you understand, I think, so once you understand who Superman is, once you understand who Clark is, and the connective tissue that Clark has, whether it's to the land in Smallville, Kansas, whether it's his farm style upbringing, whether it's the way his parents raised him, whether it's things he's been exposed to since as Superman, and you understand where he is as a character, which is to say, what does humanity mean to this incredibly powerful character, then how can you not write interesting stories? And so I always find myself kind of drawn to that and the perpetual questions that exist around the character that way. I think one of the beauties of seeing Superman and Lois together always was, because let's face it, Lois showed up in Action Comics #1 back in 1938, just like Superman did. She helped to humanize him. And I think further now that having them together as parents with young John, that John helps to do that as well. And I think the level of humanity we bring to Superman is really what makes the character work, especially when combined with that tremendous power. And that's a kind of a long, rambling answer to the question, but I think it's reality.
It's perfect. It's interesting. There are a few people that have had such a long career with the character, and I think one of the things that you do very well, and I noted this when I was reviewing Action Comics during Rebirth, is that you don't do what you did 30 years ago. You're not bringing out the old bag of tricks and just retelling that. Because as fans, you hear a lot like, well, if they just got such and such creators back on the character, he'd be perfect again, ignoring the fact that you all are human and have had experiences in that time that shapes your artistic output. So that's one of the things that I like, particularly about seeing how you come to it. Because 6 issues in the New 52 is kind of a blip, but I think you tried to make it work when you were on the book.
So I gotta say, when they asked me about doing that, I first said no. And I talked to George Perez, who had been doing it, and George said, "Careful, they won't let me do Superman. They're not going to let you do Superman." And I let Keith Giffen talk me into it, and I probably shouldn't. We did what we could with it, but I don't think at that time. And this is what George found. And I shouldn't speak for George, but he did. He and I discussed it, and he told me this, and it was that he wasn't able to do Superman the way he saw it as being done, the way he wanted to do it. And I kind of perceived that would be the same case with me. And then I let Keith talk me into it, thinking now we'll just do whatever we want to do and they'll still print it. No, not necessarily. Doesn't always go that way. But, the funny thing is, without that, and without some of the discussions that I had around that time with some of the folks in the office, I don't know that the Lois and Clark miniseries ever would have happened. So there you go.
Yeah, it's fascinating times because obviously we don't get to look behind the scenes too much as readers, as fans. We read the stories, and as Michael said, you guys are human. You have your own experiences and things to bring to your stories. But how much has the comic book industry changed in that time? Because now we've come to the whole digital era. The internet's so much more prevalent in our lives. From a behind-the-scenes look at, as a writer and artist of comic books, how much has the industry changed for you?
Tremendously. And as all industries have. As I've been around for a while. And so I'm sure all industries have changed a lot, just like comics have. one of the things I always touch on, so this will take us back to Superman 75 and the whole Death of Superman thing in a way, which is, even people always ask the question of, could you possibly have foreseen this or that? And no, I couldn't have. I couldn't possibly have foreseen the things that come from it. And one of the reasons is because of this, and that is to even go back to those times. So it was relatively rare for the idea of DC or Marvel really to take something and collect it in something called a trade paperback. It had happened with a few things. When John did Man of Steel, they took that and collected it, I think, pretty quickly and put it out. But it's not like now where every story you do is taken and pulled into some collection and put out in at least a trade, if not a hardcover, or a couple of different versions of the hardcover and the deluxe edition and then the trade paperback and then the omnibus editions and everything else. So just this idea of our work as a creator, that our work exists just beyond the shelf life of that 1 week where the floppy comes out, that has totally shifted. That and that alone. So when you add digital to that, when you add the adaptations that have come along with it, whether it's a live action movie or, you think about Doomsday alone, who has been in video games and animation and a couple of live action efforts, whether it was Smallville or Krypton or the movies, whatever it might be. That's the kind of stuff that just back then was almost unthinkable.
Yeah, I remember when the trade for Death of Superman came out, and I saw it in a Walden Books, which dates this story. The fact that Walden Books existing, I was like, this is amazing, because it's not Dark Knight Returns or Watchmen or V for Vendetta or Dark Phoenix Saga, which seemed to be like the perennials that were the ones that were collected.
And to that point, Michael, I mean, just to throw in there, so this was, Paul Levitt's really understanding the interest that was out there in the marketplace, because they had told me. So I think Death of Superman 75, I think came out like on November 17th, 1992. And one of the things Paul did so incredibly well was to pull together everything and to get a trade paperback out for the Christmas shopping season by like the second week in December. It was very soon after that, because I knew it was coming and I hadn't even seen it. And I walked into a Target one day and they had a kind of a flat counter space just inside the front door with what must have been like 200 copies of the Death of Superman trade paperback. And that was the first time I had seen it. So I just said, whoa, and because those things just didn't happen even then. And it was a surprise. And so, here we are 30 years later, and we've got am I moving right there? No, wrong way. Okay, the 30th anniversary hardcover, which you guys will see soon enough, coming out, because hey, it's still a factor.
Yeah, I'll be buying it, because I buy them all. I think with the 3 omnibuses, I have like a load bearing books in case something ever happens to the Foundation, because they just keep getting heavier and heavier.
Well, you could make your Foundation out of these, right? I mean,
yeah, pretty much.
Yeah,
and that's funny, because in this day and age, a lot of people accuse the comic book publishers of writing for trades, in that they're extending stories so they can pad out a trade paperback. But from what you're saying, it was kind of it didn't happen back then. You were just getting the floppies, and that was it. The idea of collecting these stories for a shelf life beyond what you were doing was kind of unheard of.
Yeah, well, at that time it was. So yeah, and I think that's now a fair criticism. And it's something I try and find various workarounds that if there's a way to do a two-issue story within a set of 6 or something like that. I played around with that a little bit with the recent Blue and Gold project that I wrote, which was, Booster Gold and Blue Beetle, which is, can we find a way to do like a set of 2 stories that take place within the larger scheme of 8, so that there's some satisfaction, that you get a little bit of an ending here and there without necessarily having to just say, chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Because I do think in a way that does shortchange the marketplace, that what we have done, I think, is made it very, very difficult for the so-called casual reader to access our product.
Yep, I couldn't agree more.
Now, shifting to the recent 30th anniversary special, how hard was it to get the band back together, so to speak, to get the 4 different stories?
Yeah, so the way that came together is I realized last year that we had the 30th coming up, and I went to DC and said, do you want to do anything with the 30th anniversary of Superman? And they said, well, what do you have in mind? And I said, some kind of a cool commemorative sort of project that also deals with new stuff, and we get the original teams back together to work on it. And there was a little thought of, well, how about we get all sorts of new people doing interpretation. I said, no, I think we want to get the original group back together. And so as we started to do it, everybody was certainly interested from day one in getting involved. Roger Stern had a couple of deadline problems where he first said, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to take part. And I said, no, Roger, you have to, because if you don't, it won't be the same without you. That, you have to be here, along with, Wheezy and Jerry as writers, and the same group as artists and everything else. That was the goal from the start, is to make sure that everybody would be able to partake and to get the old group back together. And as you said, get the band back together again, in order to just kind of look back on what we did back at the time and put a little bit of a modern spin on it.
Yeah, I think what gets kind of lost in all of the think pieces and commentary on the story is that when you and Jerry and Louise and Roger and John and Tom and all of them were doing these books, like it had never, titles had connected before the Superman books did the Never-Ending Battle system, or the Triangle era, whatever we want to call it. But it seems like for y'all specifically, it was lightning in a bottle. You guys came together, you worked well together, and you crafted stories that you came for Superman, but you stayed for Clark and Lois and Jimmy and Perry. And I think that's one of the most special things about this special, and I think what the stories kind of show people is that your era was a really special time within the history of Superman.
Thank you. I don't want to sit here and sound like I'm patting myself on the back, but I do think you're right that it was a special era. And I think there's plenty of evidence to back that up. And, it was, even before we did the Death Of, we had gotten around where we built this technique of how we were going to connect the books. So it started with just 2 of the titles, with Superman and Adventures Of, and then later added Action, and then later added Man of Steel. And it really allowed us to kind of build the way in which we could make it work and perfect the technique. So if you go back and look at like Time and Time Again, and some of the other things we did, or the Krypton Man, that you can see us kind of building and perfecting the technique as we were putting it together, because Yeah, it's pretty easy with 2 creative teams and 2 books. And it gets a little more complicated when you add 3. And by the time you get to 4, it's much more so. But it also expands the canvas and allows you to tell stories that do focus on the supporting cast, which is the soap opera stuff that people would really come to care about. And yeah, we all want to see Superman punching out the bad guy. We want to see that sense of action. We want to see Superman as a leader in that. But you're right. People wanted to see, Clark and Lois and Jimmy and Perry and Alice. And I mean, you go down the list. Bibbo, I mean, good God, why he didn't get his own title, I still can't understand. But, it kept people around. And that's where we see what a tremendous editor Mike Carlin was to help pioneer all of that, keep everybody together and help to keep us focused so we could do what we did.
Yeah, it's just just hearing about the super summits and all those things that you guys did to be able to keep it all together, and then you added a 5th title when you had the skip weeks. It was just like
right,
phenomenal.
Yeah, and even when we did the Death of, I was also writing and drawing Justice League, so it wasn't that hard. Well, from an hours committed to the project, it was hard, but we could still pull that in and have it function as a 5th book for a couple of months during the Death of run. So, and when you do that, the beauty of it was, because sometimes when we get the company-wide crossovers, people complain about the fact that it's too expansive and it's just too much. Yet there we were with the Death of Superman, which even at a book a week allowed us to tell this big, sprawling, massive story that at the same time was accessible. And that was part of the magic that made it work.
Michael, I'll let you ask the next one because you wrote it and you want to not just ask the question but say a thank you.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I skipped one. This isn't so much a question as a thank you for including Mitch Anderson in the story in the way you did. I got to the we get the books like a week or 2 early to write the reviews. It's embargoed, so I can't talk about it, which was hard, by the way. Not to immediately take to social media and start shouting about it. But when I saw Mitch Anderson, I was just like, okay, this is really going to be special. So the question that came out of that was, how hard was riding the line between telling a story that's going to kind of stand on its own and be compelling on its own, but still work in the fact that you're doing this as a celebration of a previous story?
Yeah. So, I think that part of it is, in a way, you brought it up earlier when you were talking about kind of the Rebirth stuff, and still being a creator who had been there years earlier, who could still find new things to say about Superman and bring new material to it. So in this, certainly what I wanted in this book, in terms of the story that I was doing, was a sense of representation in terms of what was new, as well as what was there before. And I thought that the nice thing about Jon is, in this story, Jon represents, in a lot of ways, readers who know about the Death of Superman. They might have read the trade paperback, but weren't necessarily there back in 1992 when the book came out and all the Manic stuff was going on, right? And so one of the ways to help show that and illustrate that passage of time was Mitch Anderson. If we go back to when we did that story in 1992, one of the things that was very common out there in the world at that time was what we called Marvel zombies, right? And we all probably remember, Marvel zombies were the guys who would just go out and buy, and God love them, every single Marvel title, as long as it had the Marvel logo on the book. And they were, affectionately referred to as Marvel zombies back in those early 90s. And so Mitch kind of represented them because of his, obvious, who cares about Superman kind of attitude. I like Guy Gardner better. And so I thought, okay, so if I bring Mitch back now, we can see that convergence in him where he has now totally become an admirer of Superman. He also helps to show the passage of time and can represent what happened in those days and what was going on while Jon represents the new. So the whole intent when I started to put the story together was to find that balance of old and new. And really, that's what I try and do in my work all the time anyway. I think comics are this delicate balance of readers wanting to see something new, but not something that so alienates them from their favorite characters because the characters become too warped to recognize. And that is a delicate line to walk. And from time to time, we all look at characters who get broken because they got a little too warped and pushed a little too far over the line, and then a creative team has to come in and pull them back a little bit. And I think that's been an ongoing dialogue with comics and comic readers since, like day one. I always wonder, how many people picked up Showcase number 4 and saw Barry Allen for the first time and said, well, it's not Jay Garrick. I don't know. But it's always been there and it always will be there.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm just imagining Twitter during the Silver Age, hashtag not my Green Lantern. And I can say, this is anecdotal evidence, to be fair, but I can say that the Mitch Andersons of the world were alive and well. I was one of the few comic reading people in my high school that read the Superman books. So when Death of Superman came out, suddenly it was one of the few times that I was ever like on the cutting edge of something. Probably the last time as well. But yeah, so what was it like though, heading back to the drawing table to draw? Because what I found interesting is that it's very recognizably, I guess I should say, because I can speak English, I promise. Your Superman, but the S had texture to it, kind of like a raised effect, and you had the gauntlets, which I never understood, but at least the trunks are back.
Right.
Which is how I put that in my head. So what was it like heading back, and was it your idea to have the panels go down in number on the page as the story progressed?
Yeah, in fact, if we were to dig out and print my original one-page pitch on the project, pretty sure I listed it right there, that the story I would do would evoke the death of story by starting at 4 panels and going, 3, 2, 1 splash page. The one thing I wanted to do was end it with a 3-page fold out, just like we did Superman 75. And what DC came back with was to say, well, rather than that, what if you did that with the cover? We'll give you the 3-page fold out on the cover. And I said, okay, I can make that work. So we went, 4 panels, 3, 2, 1, and then ended with a double-page spread. And that's as close as we got. But that was part of it. And, the funny thing is, guys, that a lot of times I have told people over the years about, how that story worked and the fact that artistically we decided to do it that way. And a lot of people said, I didn't notice it at the time, but that was so cool. Or they'll say, you did? And then they'll look at the trade or whatever and say, and notice it for the first time. So it was one of those things that if you didn't really perceive it while you read it, you did on a subconscious level because you started to read the story faster and faster. That was the reason, right? That as with the fewer panels, the faster you were reading it and you felt the story pick up pace. So I said, yeah, I'm going to do that in the special. So it was fun to do. It was really a lot of fun to get Brett back and work with him on an interior. We had been doing some cover work for a while now. So I said, Brett, just like you told Roger, you have to be the guy to ink this. We can't do it without you, and let's get back and do an interior for the first time in like 25 years. So it was a lot of fun.
Now, where did the idea of Doombreaker come from?
I had already had the idea that, and again, this would have been part of the original pitch, that that chunk of bone that is separated from Doomsday in Superman 75 was going to give us a new character of some kind. And, the question is, what would he be? How are we going to make it work? We went through a few discussions on that one, and there's a scene in the book where Jon calls him Doomerang, and originally that was the name. was that we sort of had a holding in place name was Doomerang, but it was the idea of, once again, going back to what was a single panel in Superman 75 and using that as a seed that could give us something new today, and then doing a different sort of a spin on it, where instead of just redoing Doomsday somehow or bringing him back again, what happens if that piece of bone somehow infects someone else? And that's where we ended up with Doombreaker.
Fascinating.
And at the same time, what I also loved about it was by just mentioning that there were people that cleaned up after Doomsday's rampage, which y'all had a large canvas during Funeral for a Friend, but you didn't have enough time to delve into the basically damage control coming in and cleaning up. You got to explore that, as well as showing that at the end of the day, Superman is going to help this guy even if he is tearing up the city. Like,
yes.
It's not his fault that he's in this predicament. So it ends up being like the original, just a great reflection of who the character is in general.
Thank you. One of the problems I ended up with was, so I only had 40 pages, and 40 pages sounds like a lot, except if a bunch of pages are single page panels or double page panels, the real estate goes in a hurry. So it was, in many respects, really rather difficult. The first plot I wrote for it, by the time I got it done, I said, this is 60 pages. This is not going to work. And I had to cut and trim because I was so committed to the idea that this was going to be a problem that Superman would fix by the end of the story, that it had to be that. I didn't want it to be Superman punching Doombreaker up out of the atmosphere, never to be seen again. I wanted a real kind of a solution for the purposes of this story, because I think that this has to stand in a way as a bit of a one-shot album, that one day, just as this 30th anniversary edition that's going to be out soon has Day of Doom collected in it, that this book might well be collected in an edition with Superman 75 some way, somehow. That would be very appropriate, and I wanted it to stand that way.
I kind of hope so, too, because Day of Doom seems to be something, I don't want to say it's forgotten, but it just seems to be not really part of the conversation. When, it not only ties into the Doomsday story, it came out during an anniversary year.
It did. And, I think part of that is because, I don't think DC really knew what to do with it at the time, which is, so it's early 2000s. The world of comics is a lot different. I wasn't working on any of the Superman titles, at that point. So I think they wanted to kind of position Superman a very different way. So here's Jurgens and Sienkiewicz doing this thing, and what do we do with it? Well, and so I think there were some mixed feelings there about it. So it's nice now that they can pick up on it again, because I think it was a very credible project.
Now, we've been reflecting on the last 30 years and looking back, but I think it's time to look forward and ask you, how excited are you to return to telling stories about Lois, Clark, and Jon moving forward?
Oh, it's a lot of fun. Part of it is the magic of working with Lee Weeks. Lee is such a tremendous artist, and I think, is so perfectly attuned to those three characters and the way he portrays them, that I think when you look at them on the page, they feel like a family unit. You can feel, I think, because he draws them with such sensitivity, you can feel the emotional connection and the love uh, among the three of them, which is so crucial. And he's just ideal for this. And so to be able to work with Lee again, to kind of get back to that same kind of environment that we had when we did the Lois and Clark mini, and have Jon as a kid again, but now with his powers and somewhat in emergence, and to have that sensibilities about them where you can still do the adventure with Jon but still have the familial connections and everything. It's special to be able to get back to that.
That's fantastic. We are getting towards the end of our hour with you, but is there anything you wanted to add or state that if you had got to ask yourself a question you would have asked?
I don't know about that as much as I would say, thank you to everyone who has been around for these 30 years. One of the special things about this is that to this day, I don't do a convention, I don't do a store appearance without at least one person coming up to me and saying, the death of Superman got me into comics, or this was my first comic book, or they all have stories like, my mom and dad let me skip school that day and took me to the comic store to get this, or my dad picked me up at school and we went and stood out in the rain for 2 hours to get this comic book. It sounds corny, and I don't mean it to, but it is special to hear that, because 30 years later, to know that people still retain that level of interest and enthusiasm for the character, for the project, for everything else, and they want to see what we did with this recent special, I say thank you, because you, as a group of readers, changed our lives as creators, and I think changed Superman's trajectory in an incredible way, to the point where, as I said earlier, we've seen the death of Superman adapted into the different mediums, and I'm sure we'll see more. That it was a special time. It was great to be a part of it, but we couldn't have done it without everybody picking up the books.
Well, I mean,
yeah.
Sorry, go, Michael.
What I was about to say is, when we, back in 2009, started doing From Crisis to Crisis, we thought, oh, this is not only a niche podcast about Superman, this is a niche podcast about this era of Superman that's been over for a certain period of time. And what we really quickly found is, man, there were a lot of vocal fans still out there that kind of came out of the woodwork to talk about it. And, if you would have told, I didn't have, I liked sports growing up. I watched boxing and football with my dad and stuff, but I never had like sports figures as like heroes or people I looked up to. And same with like rock stars and stuff. It was the people producing the comics I read. And if you would have told 16-year-old Mike that 30 years later he was going to spend the week of the anniversary of the death of Superman and he gets to talk to Dan Jurgens for an hour, he would have lost his mind. He would have also asked what the internet was, but that's a larger conversation to have.
Well, that's very nice to hear. One of the magic things about this is that we're also grateful of, in terms of this special, that we're still all around to be able to contribute. That, you look at the past few months of the people we have lost in this business, that the friends we have lost and the colleagues that we have lost and the talent and everything. One of the best parts about this is we never had to have within our group the conversation of, well, so-and-so isn't here, who would we get? That we were all still here to contribute. And I think, to me, that's tremendously important. I think to all of us it was, and that's part of what it made it so much fun. And, that's the other reason to make sure we all got to be involved and to let everybody take another swing at bat. step up to the plate, take another crack at it, and see what you've got. And I think all the stories in this are a lot of fun, as are the new pinups. And it's been fun talking to a couple of the guys who got to do pinups, and we're really grateful to be able to take part because of what the death of Superman meant to them, the same way as you just talked about, Michael. So that's what's fun, to have a project that is this durable.
Yeah, fantastic. And if it wasn't for the death of Superman, specifically Roger Stern's novel, the Superman homepage wouldn't exist today, because that was my introduction to the comic books and to the world of this crazy world that we're all a part of. But so yeah, I just want to again thank you, Dan, for taking the time out tonight to speak to us. I know you're a busy man and you've got a lot on your plate, and we really appreciate you being a special guest on Superman Homepage Live tonight. All the fans in the comments have just been echoing that and saying what a wonderful interview it has been, and want to thank you once again for taking out your time with us tonight.
This is great fun, and I'll just throw this out very quickly for you, Steve, and that is that a couple of nights ago I did a signing at a comic store, and somehow, I don't remember exactly how, Roger's book came up, and there was someone standing there who just said, "What? There's a book?" And it's like, yeah, it came out very shortly after the death of Superman. Roger was actually writing it as we were doing this story, and he made it his mission to go find that. So there you go. People still have that level of interest, and it's a great read. So why not? Go find it and read it. Exactly.
Well, thanks again, Dan. Really appreciate it, and keep up the good work. We look forward to reading your stories in Action Comics, and once again, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, guys. It was my pleasure.
Well, folks, so that's Superman Homepage Live for tonight. On behalf of myself and Michael Bailey, thanks for watching our program tonight. Really appreciate it. Don't forget, we'll be back next week on November 21st for another edition of Superman Homepage Live at 7:30 p.m. Until then, be sure to check out supermanhomepage.com for all your daily news updates on everything surrounding the Man of Steel. I'm Steve Eunice on behalf of myself and Michael Bailey and Dan Jurgens. Thanks for watching Superman Homepage Live, brought to you by supermanhomepage.com. Bye.